My son and daughter-in-law had been living in my home rent-free while they saved for a house. Then I overheard her telling her boss that she owned the place and that she was generously letting me stay there. I didn't confront her. I simply waited for Saturday night. The front porch of my suburban Ohio Craftsman had always felt peaceful until Vanessa moved in last autumn. My son Mark called it a temporary arrangement while they saved for a down payment, and I gladly opened my doors. I was 65, retired from 30 years as a structural draftsman and happy to share the space. But lately, subtle changes filled the hallway. Vanessa replaced my framed botanical prints with abstract metallic art without asking. She reorganized my pantry, sliding my flower bins into dark bottom cabinets. I did not complain, preferring peace over trivial household friction. Then came Friday afternoon, when our neighbor Mr. Henderson walked up the driveway with a box of fresh heirloom tomatoes. I stepped out to greet him, wiping my hands on my apron. Mr. Henderson asked if I needed help adjusting the cedar fence gate I had built 15 years ago with my late husband. Before I could answer, Vanessa glided past me onto the porch, smoothing her linen blouse. She laughed softly, adjusting her gold bracelet while positioning herself between Mr. Henderson and me. She thanked him warmly, stating that she and Mark were planning to replace the entire fence next month to modernize the property. When I started to mention that the cedar post was perfectly sound, Vanessa leaned over, pressed her hand tightly against my forearm, and whispered in a sharp, hurried tone, "Just smile. Don't correct me." I felt her fingers dig into my sleeve as she smiled brightly at the neighbor. I stood still on the hardwood deck, watching her take credit for future renovations on a home she did not own. Instead of arguing in the driveway, I gently withdrew my arm from her grip. I smiled politely at Mr. Henderson, turned around, and walked back inside to mark my calendar with a bold red circle around the upcoming weekend, when their friends were scheduled to arrive for a catered summer dinner party in the backyard. The next morning, I woke at 6 to make coffee in my usual copper percolator. As I poured water into the pot, Mark entered the kitchen wearing his athletic shorts and sneakers. He looked tired, rubbing his eyes while avoiding direct eye contact with me. I handed him a mug, hoping he would address the incident on the porch. Instead, Mark cleared his throat and asked if I could move my sewing table out of the sunroom before Saturday. He explained that Vanessa wanted to set up a cocktail lounge for her visiting co-workers and friends. I placed my mug on the island counter and stared at my son. I asked him if he knew what Vanessa had said to me in front of Mr. Henderson. Mark sighed, leaning against the refrigerator, and admitted that Vanessa had mentioned it. He asked me to be patient with her, explaining that she felt insecure around her corporate peers, who already owned homes in affluent suburbs. Mark said Vanessa was simply trying to project confidence and build a strong social network for her marketing career. He begged me to let her handle the social narrative for a little while, without causing unnecessary drama. I listened quietly as he spoke, noting how comfortably he minimized my dignity to protect his wife's ambition. I did not raise my voice or offer an angry retort. I merely picked up my coffee cup and agreed to vacate the sunroom for the weekend. However, as soon as Mark left for his morning run, I went straight to my home office. I retrieved the original deed to the property signed and paid off 10 years ago alongside the receipt for the recent roof replacement I had fully funded. I placed both documents neatly inside a blue folder in my top desk drawer. If my presence was being quietly reshaped, I needed my record to stay crystal clear and ready for whatever misleading stories might be told in my home. By Wednesday afternoon, the preparations for Saturday's gathering escalated. Delivery trucks arrived with rental tables, outdoor heat lamps, and crates of wine. Vanessa bustled through the downstairs rooms, directing workers and placing lavender garlands over my mahogany dining sideboard. During lunch, she sat across from me at the kitchen table while Mark was at work. She unfolded a printed guest list and highlighted names with a pink marker. Vanessa casually remarked that she had hired a local catering crew to serve appetizers, but she expected me to handle the kitchen cleanup throughout the evening to save on labor costs. She suggested that I wear a plain, dark cardigan so I would blend seamlessly into the background while clearing plates. I set my fork down on my plate, looking at her composed demeanor. Vanessa smiled thinly, explaining that having an active, independent mother-in-law mingling with high-profile guests might confuse the story she had shared with her executive boss. She noted that her boss admired young couples who managed large estates entirely on their own merit. I asked her directly what narrative she had shared with her team regarding my residency. Vanessa shrugged, adjusting her manicured nails, and said she simply let people assume what was most convenient for her professional advancement. She added that nobody needed to know the details of our financial living arrangements as long as everyone played their role smoothly. I did not argue or demand an apology. Instead, I stood up, cleared my own dish, and went to my room. That evening, I called my longtime friend Arthur, who ran a consulting firm in town. I invited him to attend the party as my personal guest. Arthur accepted, warmly promising to arrive early in his finest suit. Vanessa wanted me to play the invisible domestic helper in my own house, but I was already drafting a different role for the evening, one that would honestly reflect the truth of who truly built this life and this home. On Thursday afternoon, I walked past the living room and heard Vanessa speaking loudly on speakerphone with her supervisor, Julian. She was describing the extensive architectural modifications made to the house over the past year. She claimed that she had personally designed the vaulted timber ceiling in the sunroom and selected the white oak flooring throughout the ground floor. In reality, those custom features were drawn on my drafting table 20 years ago and installed using my life savings alongside my late husband. Julian praised her lavish taste and noted how impressive it was for a young professional to maintain such a high-value asset in today's economy. Vanessa laughed airily, remarking that it required strict management and budgeting, but she was happy to accommodate her aging mother-in-law in the rear bedroom as an act of family charity. Hearing her frame my generous hospitality as her personal charity sent a cold wave of clarity through me. She continued talking, assuring Julian that the upcoming party would showcase their prosperous lifestyle and prove her readiness for the regional director promotion. I stood quietly in the hallway, adjusting the strap of my wristwatch. I realized then that Vanessa's behavior was not just innocent vanity or youthful exaggeration. It was a deliberate strategy to build her career prestige by stepping on my reputation and erasing my ownership. Mark walked down the stairs a moment later, holding a stack of printer paper. He caught my eye and looked away quickly, clearly aware of what his wife was saying into the phone. He said nothing to defend me or correct her claims. I gave Mark a calm, measured look, refusing to express anger or distress. I simply walked into the kitchen, pulled out my notebook, and wrote down the names of every guest Vanessa had mentioned, ensuring I was fully prepared for Saturday's event and the inevitable confrontation that would follow when false stories met the unyielding truth of my lifetime of hard work. Friday morning arrived with rain tapping softly against the bay window. I sat at the kitchen counter reviewing my personal monthly expenses. Mark walked in wearing his business suit, holding a printed list of household grocery items. He placed the paper in front of me and asked if I could drive to the specialty market in town to pick up imported cheeses, wine glasses, and cured meats for the party. He mentioned that Vanessa was busy at her hair appointment and could not complete the errands. I looked at the long list of expensive gourmet items, then raised my eyes to look at my son. I asked Mark directly who was paying for the items on the list. Mark shifted his weight nervously, stating that since they were hosting so many guests, it would be helpful if I covered the groceries as my contribution to the event. I closed my expense notebook with a firm click. I reminded Mark that I paid all property taxes, homeowner insurance, and utility bills for the entire house while allowing them to live here rent-free so they could save money. I stated calmly that I would not spend $500 on specialty food to help maintain a false narrative that degraded my standing in my own home. Mark stared at me, visibly uncomfortable, and pleaded with me not to make things difficult right before Vanessa's big company event. He insisted that Vanessa was under immense pressure and that supporting her now would benefit the whole family in the long run. I stood up from the stool, placed the grocery list neatly back in his hand, and refused. I told him that respect was a two-way street, and if Vanessa wanted a catered feast, she and Mark would have to fund it themselves. I walked to my room, leaving Mark standing alone in the quiet kitchen to ponder the consequences of their continued presumption and lack of genuine gratitude toward my generous living arrangements. By Friday evening, the atmosphere in the house had grown noticeably chilly. Vanessa returned home late, her footsteps echoing sharply across the wooden hallway floorboards. She barely acknowledged my presence as I sat reading in the living room armchair. Instead of asking me to clean or serve during Saturday's event, she made alternative arrangements, hiring 2 temporary staff members from a local catering company to manage food assembly and tray service. I observed her frantic organization from a distance, remaining entirely peaceful. Later that night, while Mark and Vanessa were upstairs reviewing the evening schedule, I went into my home studio. I opened my drafting drawers and selected a framed, high-resolution original architectural blueprint of the house. On the bottom right corner of the blue paper, my signature and registration seal as a certified structural draftsman were clearly stamped alongside the construction date from 2 decades prior. I cleaned the glass pane with a soft microfiber cloth until it shone flawlessly. I then placed the framed drawing inside a decorative leather presentation portfolio, along with a laminated copy of the property title deed. I set the portfolio on the side table near the entryway coat closet. My intention was not to cause a public spectacle or throw insults across a crowded room. My objective was simple: if someone directly asked about the origins or ownership of this craftsman house, I would be fully prepared to provide undeniable physical evidence without raising my voice or engaging in petty disputes. I went to bed early that night, sleeping soundly while the rain cleared away, leaving a crisp, bright morning sky for the upcoming weekend. I knew that whatever unfolded during Saturday's event, I would remain anchored in truth, dignity, and absolute self-respect within the home I had built with my own hands, unfazed by the shallow pretenses that others attempted to construct around me to elevate their own perceived social standing in front of their wealthy and influential corporate colleagues and peers. Saturday evening arrived with a pleasant breeze filtering through the patio doors. By 6 o'clock, cars lined the quiet suburban street outside. Guests streamed through the front entrance, greeted by string quartet music playing from speakers hidden in the ivy. Vanessa wore an elegant silk evening dress, floating around the living room and offering custom cocktails to her colleagues. Julian, her executive supervisor, stood near the fireplace with 3 senior vice presidents holding crystal glasses. At 6:30, Arthur arrived looking dapper in his charcoal suit. I welcomed him warmly at the door, taking his coat and introducing him to several guests near the foyer. When Vanessa noticed Arthur talking engagingly with a prominent local business owner, she glided over with a bright, calculated smile. She introduced herself as the host and homeowner, taking credit for the custom oak finishes and landscaped patio garden. Arthur listened politely, glancing sideways at me with a knowing glint in his eye. Vanessa then turned toward me, her smile tightening slightly around the edges. She remarked loudly enough for Julian's group to hear that it was wonderful having her elderly mother-in-law present to enjoy the event. She added that she and Mark were always happy to provide a comfortable, rent-free sanctuary for me in my retirement years, framing my presence as an act of dutiful family generosity. Several guests offered soft, sympathetic smiles in my direction, clearly accepting her narrative that I was a dependent relative being taken care of out of charity. I did not frown or express annoyance. I simply held my champagne glass, steadily met Vanessa's gaze, and offered a calm, agreeable smile, adhering strictly to her request to stay quiet and refrain from making a scene. But I noticed Arthur discreetly checking his watch, knowing that the main evening toasts were scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes in the central dining hall before the main course was served by the catering staff to all the assembled corporate executives. By 7:15, all 25 guests gathered around the long dining table, decorated with floral arrangements and brass candle holders. Mark sat near the head of the table, looking nervous, occasionally sweating through his collar. Vanessa stood up, tapping her water goblet with a silver spoon to call for everyone's attention. She gave a polished speech thanking her colleagues for coming and expressing gratitude for her successful year at the firm. She then gestured toward the room, making another deliberate comment about how hard she and Mark had worked to purchase and renovate this magnificent property in such an exclusive neighborhood. Mark dropped his napkin on his plate, staring down at his hands, remaining silent as usual. Julian raised his glass, offering a return toast. He complimented Vanessa on her ambition and stated that her ability to manage such a valuable real estate investment reflected her leadership capabilities. Julian then turned toward me, smiling politely, and said it must be a comfort for me to be cared for so well by my son and daughter-in-law. In my sunset years. The room fell into a polite quiet, waiting for me to nod in agreement. I looked at Mark, giving him one final opportunity to step in, clear his throat, and speak the honest truth on behalf of his mother. Mark glanced up briefly, met my eyes with an expression of helpless embarrassment, but chose to stay silent, taking a sip of his wine instead. I set my napkin down on the table, feeling no anger, only a profound sense of clarity. The period of quiet compliance was officially over. I stood up gracefully, smoothing my skirt, and walked toward the entryway side table where my leather portfolio rested in plain sight, ready to be brought into the dining hall for everyone to examine when the inevitable direct question about the property's legal deed and true owner was finally raised in front of the entire gathering of distinguished guests and company executives. I re-entered the dining room holding the presentation portfolio. Before I could speak, Arthur stood up from his chair, turning to Julian with a warm smile. Arthur asked Julian directly if he was aware of who had designed and built this custom craftsman home 20 years ago. Julian looked puzzled and turned to Vanessa, who froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. Arthur explained to the table that as a local commercial developer, he had hired me as the lead structural draftsman for several city projects decades ago. He stated clearly that I had personally drawn every blueprint and fully paid off the mortgage on this home long before Mark and Vanessa ever met. The room fell into total silence. Julian turned to Vanessa and asked who owned the house. Vanessa's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at me desperately, whispering under her breath, "Please, just smile. Don't correct me." I looked at her calmly, then opened my portfolio on the dining table. I pulled out the original stamped blueprint and the paid deed, laying them flat under the chandelier light. I spoke in a quiet, measured voice that carried across the entire room. I explained that I had stayed quiet out of respect for my son, but I could not allow my hard work and life legacy to be erased and framed as dependent charity. I stated clearly that I